The sheriff's notice was still warm from the printer when 10-year-old Maya pressed her nose against the apartment window, watching their belongings pile up on the sidewalk below. Her twin brother Lucas stood beside her, his small fist clenched around a worn baseball they'd found in a thrift store months ago. Neither of them understood exactly what foreclosure meant, but they knew it was the reason their mother had been crying into her hands at the kitchen table for 3 days straight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air carried the scent of approaching rain as neighbors gathered to watch the spectacle. Some whispered behind cupped hands, others pretended not to see. Maya counted 17 cardboard boxes, 2 mismatched suitcases, and their mother's old rocking chair that had belonged to their grandmother. Everything they owned, reduced to a pile on the cracked pavement of Elm Street. Their mother, Sarah, emerged from the building with the last of their possessions, her auburn hair escaping from a hastily tied ponytail. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her nurse's scrubs hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight over the past months, picking at dinner while making sure the twins ate every bite. The medical bills from Maya's appendectomy the year before had drained their savings, and the hospital's payment plans had proven impossible to maintain on a single income. "Mom, where are we going to sleep tonight?" Lucas asked, his voice small and uncertain. He'd been the quieter of the twins since their father left 2 years ago, but his questions always cut straight to the heart of things. Sarah knelt beside her children, pulling them close. The fabric softener scent of her uniform mixed with something else, something that smelled like worry and sleepless nights. "We'll figure it out, baby. We always do." But her voice wavered, and Maya noticed how her hands trembled as she smoothed down Lucas's unruly brown hair. The twins had heard the late-night phone calls. Sarah pleading with relatives who had their own struggles, calling old friends who had moved on to different lives. The motel down on Highway 9 wanted $50 a night, money they didn't have. The homeless shelter had a waiting list that stretched 2 weeks out. As the afternoon wore on, their pile of belongings sat untouched. Other tenants hurried past with averted eyes, the weight of their own precarious situations making them unwilling to get involved. Maya watched a sparrow land on their television set, tilt its head, then fly away. Even the birds, it seemed, knew better than to stick around. The old pickup truck appeared around the corner just as the first drops of rain began to fall. It was the kind of vehicle that had seen better decades, with rust eating at the wheel wells and a tailgate that didn't quite align. But it ran, and more importantly, it slowed to a stop in front of their makeshift yard sale of desperation. The man who climbed out moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to consider his actions. He was tall and lean, probably in his early 40s, with calloused hands and the kind of tan that came from working outdoors rather than lying on beaches. His jeans were clean but worn, and his flannel shirt had been mended at the elbow with thread that almost matched. Everything about him suggested a man who fixed things rather than replacing them. "Excuse me," he said, approaching Sarah with the cautious respect of someone interrupting a private moment. "I couldn't help but notice. Are you folks all right?" Sarah straightened, instinctively positioning herself between the stranger and her children. 2 years of single parenthood had sharpened her protective instincts to a fine edge. "We're managing, thank you." The man nodded, glancing at the eviction notice that had blown against their cardboard boxes. "I'm Daniel Morrison. I live about 10 miles out on Creek Road. I was just heading into town for supplies when I saw." He gestured vaguely at their situation, then stopped himself. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to intrude." Maya studied him from behind her mother's legs. He had kind eyes, the sort that crinkled at the corners from squinting into sun and wind. His voice carried the slight drawl of someone who'd grown up in rural places, where people still said please and thank you without irony. But it was his hands that caught her attention. They were gentle as they rested at his sides, not fidgeting or demanding attention. "The thing is," Daniel continued, seeming to choose his words carefully, "I've got a barn on my property. It's been converted, has electricity and running water, even a small kitchen. My brother used to stay there when he visited, but he's been gone for years now. It's just sitting empty." Sarah's expression hardened. "We're not looking for charity." "No, ma'am, I wouldn't presume." Daniel's voice remained steady, unoffended by her defensive tone. "I was thinking more along the lines of a trade. The place needs some fixing up, and I could use help with general maintenance around the property. Nothing too strenuous, just the kind of work that keeps a place from falling apart." Lucas stepped forward, his curiosity overcoming his usual shyness. "Do you have animals?" A small smile tugged at Daniel's lips. "I've got a few chickens, an old goat named Gertie who thinks she's a dog, and a barn cat called Patches who's excellent at pretending to work." He paused, studying the boy's face. "Do you like animals?" "We always wanted a pet," Maya chimed in, earning a warning look from their mother. "But our landlord said no pets in the apartment." The rain was falling steadier now, darkening the cardboard boxes and threatening their few possessions. Sarah looked up at the gray sky, then at her children's hopeful faces, then at this stranger who'd appeared like something from a different kind of story. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Morrison, but we don't even know you." "That's fair," Daniel acknowledged. "Tell you what, why don't you follow me out there and take a look? If it doesn't feel right, no harm done. If it does, we can talk about what kind of arrangement might work for everyone." Sarah hesitated, weighing options she didn't really have. The rain was picking up, and darkness would come early with the storm clouds rolling in. The twins were watching her with the kind of hope that children carried despite evidence to the contrary, and she found herself nodding before her practical mind could object. They loaded their belongings into Daniel's truck and Sarah's aging Honda, a caravan of uncertainty heading into the countryside. The twins pressed their faces to the rain-streaked windows, watching the suburban streets give way to rolling fields and patches of forest. It had been months since they'd been outside the city, and Maya found herself mesmerized by the way the storm clouds cast shifting shadows across the landscape. Daniel's property appeared gradually, first as a mailbox tilting at an optimistic angle, then as a gravel driveway that curved between oak trees whose branches formed a canopy overhead. The main house was a modest farmhouse with a wraparound porch and flower boxes that had seen better seasons. But it was the barn that drew their attention. It sat about 100 yards from the house, painted red with white trim that had been recently touched up. It was larger than Maya had expected, with big windows that caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds. A small covered porch had been added to the front, complete with 2 rocking chairs and a small table between them. The previous owner did most of the conversion work, Daniel explained as they parked. "My brother was an artist, needed space to work. I've kept it up as best I can, but it could use a woman's touch." He glanced at Sarah with something that might have been respect, and maybe some young energy to bring it back to life. They ran through the rain to the barn's porch, Lucas clutching his baseball and Maya trying to keep their mother's purse dry. Daniel produced a key from his pocket, the metal worn smooth from years of use, and opened the door to reveal what could only be described as a hidden world. The interior was nothing like the utilitarian space Maya had imagined. Someone had installed hardwood floors that gleamed despite years of use. The main area was open and airy, with exposed beams that had been sanded and stained to a warm honey color. A small but complete kitchen occupied one corner, its cabinets painted a cheerful yellow that complemented the white countertops. A sleeping loft was accessible by a sturdy wooden ladder, and beneath it, a cozy sitting area surrounded a stone fireplace that looked like it had been built to last centuries. "There are 2 bedrooms through that door," Daniel said, pointing to the far end of the space. "They're small, but they each have a window and enough space for the essentials." Maya and Lucas had already begun exploring, their voices echoing with excitement as they discovered built-in bookshelves, a window seat cushioned in faded blue fabric, and a bathroom with an old clawfoot tub that someone had lovingly restored. Their laughter filled the space with a warmth that had been missing from their cramped apartment. Sarah stood in the middle of it all, turning slowly to take in every detail. The late afternoon light filtering through the rain-washed windows cast everything in soft golds and grays. It was beautiful in a way that their apartment had never been, rustic but refined, simple but thoughtfully designed. It felt like a home rather than just a place to sleep. "The rent would be—" she began, then stopped herself. They had no money for rent, no security deposit, no way to promise anything beyond gratitude, and whatever work she could manage around her nursing shifts. "Like I said, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I was thinking more of a trade arrangement, Daniel replied. The place stays empty otherwise, and I could use help keeping up with things. General maintenance, maybe some gardening when spring comes. Light housework, if you're inclined, though I don't want to assume anything about traditional roles. Sarah found herself studying his face, looking for the catch that experience had taught her to expect. Men didn't usually offer help without wanting something in return, and single mothers with limited options were often seen as easy targets for exploitation. But Daniel's expression remained open, patient, as if he understood her need to be suspicious and didn't take offense at it. "Why would you do this for strangers?" she asked directly. Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching Maya and Lucas peer out the loft window at the rain-soaked landscape. "My brother died 3 years ago," he said finally, "cancer. He spent his last months here, and the place was never the same after he was gone. Too quiet, I guess. Too empty." He paused, his voice growing softer. "Maybe it needs a family again." The twins had discovered a chest set on one of the bookshelves, the pieces carved from some dark wood that felt substantial in their small hands. Lucas was explaining the rules to Maya, though his understanding was approximate at best, and their serious discussion of strategy filled the comfortable silence. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. The space felt safe in a way that their apartment never had, despite the locks and security deposits and lease agreements. Here, the walls seemed to breathe with the settling of old wood and the whisper of rain against windows. Here, her children's laughter didn't echo off thin walls shared with neighbors who complained about noise. "There's no cell service out here," Daniel mentioned, as if reading her concerns. "But there's a landline, and the internet works well enough for whatever you might need. The school bus runs right past the mailbox, and it's only a 20-minute drive to town." Maya appeared at her mother's elbow, tugging gently on her sleeve. "Mom, can we stay? Please? I promise I'll help with whatever needs doing." Lucas nodded earnestly from across the room. "I can feed the chickens and help fix things. I'm good at fixing things." Sarah looked at her children, then at Daniel, then at the space that somehow felt like it had been waiting for them. Every practical instinct told her to be cautious, to ask more questions, to demand references and background checks and written agreements. But standing there in the golden light of the converted barn, listening to her children sound happy for the first time in months, she found herself making a decision based on something deeper than practicality. "We'll try it," she said quietly. "For a while, anyway. See how it works out for everyone." Daniel nodded, the relief in his expression so brief she almost missed it. "I'll help you get your things moved in before the rain gets worse." As they worked to transfer their belongings from the vehicles to the barn, Maya noticed things about their new landlord that her mother seemed to miss. The way he automatically lifted the heaviest boxes without being asked. How he positioned himself to shield them from the worst of the rain. The careful way he handled their grandmother's rocking chair, as if he understood it was precious, despite its worn upholstery and loose joints. Most intriguingly, she noticed that he never went inside the main house while they were moving. He helped them settle into the barn, showed them how to work the quirky hot water heater and where to find the circuit breakers, but when they were finished, he simply said goodnight and walked away through the rain, disappearing into the farmhouse like he was retreating to a completely separate world. The twins fell asleep that first night in real beds for the first time in days, the sound of rain on the barn's metal roof creating a rhythm that felt like a lullaby. Sarah sat in the window seat, watching lightning flicker across the fields, and wondered what kind of man offered strangers a place to live without asking for anything more than help with maintenance. She thought about the careful way he'd spoken about his brother, the genuine warmth in his voice when he'd talked to the twins about the animals, the fact that he'd appeared at exactly the moment when they'd run out of options. It felt too convenient, too much like the kind of story people told to make themselves feel better about the randomness of the world. But as she pulled the curtains closed and prepared for bed, Sarah found herself hoping that sometimes, just sometimes, the world worked exactly the way those stories suggested it should. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the dust from their old life away and preparing the ground for whatever would grow in its place. The morning came earlier than expected, announced by a rooster whose crow seemed to echo from somewhere near the main house. Maya was the first to wake, padding to the window in her pajamas to discover a landscape transformed by the previous night's storm. The fields stretched endlessly under a sky washed clean and blue, dotted with trees whose leaves caught the early sunlight like scattered coins. Lucas joined her at the window, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Is that really our backyard now?" "I think so," Maya whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might break whatever spell had transported them from their cardboard box existence to this place of morning light and open spaces. Their mother was already awake, moving quietly around the small kitchen as she tried to figure out how to work the coffee maker without waking her children. The unfamiliar sounds of the countryside filtered through the windows. Birdsong she couldn't identify, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through leaves that weren't confined by city blocks and traffic patterns. A soft knock at the door interrupted her exploration of the kitchen cabinets. She opened it to find Daniel standing on the porch, holding a basket covered with a checkered cloth. He looked different in the morning light. Younger somehow, though the lines around his eyes suggested someone who'd spent considerable time thinking about difficult things. "Morning," he said simply. "Thought you might need a few basics to get started." He handed her the basket, which proved to contain fresh eggs, a loaf of homemade bread that was still warm, butter wrapped in wax paper, and a mason jar of what looked like honey. "This is very kind of you," Sarah said, accepting the basket and noting the careful way he'd arranged everything. "But you really don't need to feed us on top of everything else." Daniel shrugged, the gesture carrying years of practice at downplaying his own generosity. "The chickens lay more eggs than I can use, and I bake bread most mornings anyway. Old habit." He paused, glancing past her to where the twins were now pressed against the window, watching their interaction with undisguised curiosity. "If you're interested, I was planning to show the kids around the property later. Help them get oriented before school starts up again." Maya and Lucas appeared at their mother's side so quickly that Sarah suspected they'd been listening from the moment the knock came. Their faces carried the kind of hopeful expectation that made adult decisions feel both easier and more complicated. "Can we see the chickens?" Lucas asked, his usual shyness overcome by the prospect of meeting actual farm animals. "And the goat that thinks she's a dog?" Maya added, remembering Daniel's description from the day before. Daniel's smile was genuine, transforming his weathered features with a warmth that reached his eyes. "Gertie will be disappointed if you don't come say hello. She's been watching the barn all morning, wondering who moved into her favorite napping spot." Sarah found herself nodding before she'd fully considered the implications. Something about the morning light, and the scent of fresh bread, and the sound of her children being excited about something other than survival made the decision feel natural rather than complicated. They spent the morning exploring the property like urban children discovering a new planet. Daniel proved to be a patient guide, answering endless questions about everything from why chickens needed to eat gravel to how long it took oak trees to grow tall enough to climb. He showed them the vegetable garden behind the main house, now mostly dormant for the winter, but still containing hardy greens and root vegetables that had survived the recent frost. Gertie the goat turned out to be a compact creature with intelligent eyes and an opinion about everything. She followed them around the property like an oversized dog, occasionally nudging the twins with her head when she felt they weren't paying sufficient attention to her commentary on their tour. "She used to belong to my neighbors," Daniel explained as Gertie attempted to eat Maya's shoelaces, "but when they moved to Arizona, they asked if I'd take her. Seemed cruel to make a goat adapt to desert living when she was perfectly happy here." The barn cat, Patches, remained more aloof, observing their group from strategic positions throughout the morning. A large orange and white tom with one scarred ear and the confidence of someone who'd successfully negotiated numerous territorial disputes. He seemed to approve of the twins, but reserved judgment on their mother. By lunchtime, Maya and Lucas were chattering about their discoveries with the kind of enthusiasm that had been absent from their voices for months. They'd gathered eggs from surprisingly cooperative hens, learned to identify poison ivy, and discovered a creek that ran along the back edge of the property, currently swollen with runoff from the previous night's storm. Sarah found herself watching Daniel more than she'd intended, trying to understand what motivated his kindness. He moved through his daily routine with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing the property alone for years, but there was nothing hurried or impatient in his interactions with her children. He listened to their questions with genuine interest, explained things at their level without being condescending, and somehow managed to keep them entertained without making their presence feel like a burden. Most puzzling was his relationship with the main house. During their entire morning exploration, he'd guided them around the building rather than through it, showing them the garden and the outbuildings and the various practical aspects of rural living, but never suggesting they come inside for water, or to use the bathroom, or even to escape the chilly morning air. It was as if the house existed in a separate space, one that wasn't part of the world he was willing to share. After lunch, which they ate on the barn's porch while Gertie provided entertainment by attempting to steal food from their plates, Daniel mentioned that he needed to make a trip into town for supplies. "Is there anything you folks need?" he asked. "I'm heading to the feed store and the grocery, so it's no trouble to pick up extras." Sarah started to decline automatically, then stopped herself. They needed everything: food to stock the kitchen, basic toiletries, school supplies for the twins, warm clothes for the approaching winter. There were field guides to local birds and plants, volumes of poetry by authors she'd never heard of, mysteries and science fiction novels with well-worn spines, and several thick books about art and artists that were filled with colorful reproductions of paintings. "Mom, look at this," she called, pulling out a book about famous painters. "Did you know there was a guy who painted the same water lilies over and over again?" Sarah joined her daughter on the floor, spreading the art book between them. The pages fell open to a reproduction of one of Monet's water lily paintings, the colors still vibrant despite being printed rather than painted. It had been years since Sarah had looked at art for pleasure rather than utility, and she found herself surprisingly moved by the image's peaceful beauty. "I think he was trying to capture how light changes throughout the day," she said, remembering fragments of an art history class from her college years. Same scene, but different every time because of how the sun moved across the sky. Lucas joined them, studying the painting with the serious attention he brought to anything new. "It looks like the creek out back, but prettier." They spent the rest of the afternoon looking through the art books, discovering worlds of color and imagination that felt impossibly far from their recent experience of cardboard boxes and eviction notices. Maya was particularly fascinated by a book of photographs showing artist studios, spaces that were messy and creative and alive with the evidence of work being done. "I bet this barn used to look like that when Daniel's brother lived here," she said, pointing to a photograph of a painter's studio cluttered with canvases and brushes and tubes of paint squeezed into abstract sculptures. Sarah looked around the immaculately organized space they now called home and tried to imagine it filled with the organized chaos of creative work. It was easier than she'd expected, as if the barn carried some memory of its former life as an artist's studio, waiting for the right moment to remember what it had been designed to contain. Daniel returned as the sun was setting, his truck loaded with more supplies than Sarah had expected. In addition to basic groceries and household necessities, he'd brought art supplies for the twins, warm jackets that looked suspiciously new, and a selection of books that suggested he'd been paying attention to their interests during the day's conversations. "The art store was having a sale," he explained when Maya discovered the box of colored pencils and sketch pads. Seemed like a shame to pass up good supplies. Lucas found a beginner's guide to woodworking in his pile, complete with a small set of tools designed for young hands. His eyes went wide with the kind of wonder that suggested Christmas morning had arrived unexpectedly in the middle of autumn. "These are really for us?" he asked, running his fingers over the smooth handles of the child-sized tools. "Figure you might want to try building something," Daniel said. "I've got plenty of scrap wood, and it's always good to know how to fix things that break." As they unloaded the supplies and organized their new possessions, Sarah noticed that Daniel moved with the same careful efficiency she'd observed earlier, never wasting motion but never seeming hurried. He helped them put away groceries and answered the twins' questions about using their new art supplies. But, as darkness fell, he once again retreated to the main house without inviting them to join him. The twins fell asleep that night, surrounded by new books and art supplies, their voices full of plans for projects and explorations. Sarah sat in the window seat again, but this time, instead of worrying about their uncertain future, she found herself wondering about Daniel's past. What kind of man accumulated such an understanding of children's interests? Why did he live alone in a house that seemed designed for a family? And what had happened to make him so generous with strangers while remaining so clearly isolated from the world? Outside her window, a light glowed in the farmhouse's kitchen, suggesting that Daniel was still awake, perhaps sitting at his own table, looking out at the barn that now sheltered the family he'd rescued from their pile of cardboard boxes. The image made her feel less alone than she had in months, even though they were still essentially strangers sharing the same patch of rural darkness. For the first time since the eviction notice had arrived, Sarah allowed herself to hope that they might have found more than just temporary shelter. Maybe, if they were careful and grateful and useful enough to earn their place, they'd found something that could grow into a real home. 3 weeks into their new life, Maya discovered the first clue entirely by accident. She'd been chasing Patches around the property, trying to convince the barn cat to pose for a portrait she was drawing, when the orange Tom darted under a loose board in what appeared to be an old storage shed behind the main house. Maya crawled after him, her small frame fitting easily through the gap that Patches had exploited. Inside the forgotten space, dusty light filtered through cracks in the weathered wood, illuminating something that made her catch her breath. Stacked against the walls were canvases, dozens of them, covered with paint-splattered sheets that suggested they'd been hastily hidden rather than carefully stored. She lifted the corner of one sheet and gasped. The painting beneath was extraordinary, a landscape that captured the morning light across the very field she could see from the barn's windows, but rendered with a skill that transformed the familiar view into something magical. The brushstrokes were confident and free, the colors so vivid they seemed to glow even in the shed's dim interior. Maya carefully replaced the sheet and squeezed back through the gap, her mind racing. Daniel had said his brother was an artist, but these paintings suggested someone far more accomplished than a hobbyist who'd needed space to work. The signature in the corner of the landscape was too faded to read clearly, but the style was unmistakably professional. She said nothing about her discovery, but found herself watching Daniel more carefully over the following days. He moved through his routines with the same quiet efficiency, tending to the animals, maintaining the property, making his weekly trips to town for supplies. But Maya began to notice things that hadn't seemed significant before. The way he paused sometimes when looking at the fields, as if seeing them through different eyes. How his hands moved when he was thinking, fingers tracing shapes in the air that might have been brushstrokes. The fact that he never seemed to run out of art supplies when the twins needed them, despite claiming he'd bought them on sale in town. Lucas, meanwhile, had become fascinated with the woodworking tools Daniel had provided. Every afternoon after school, he could be found in the barn's main room, carefully sanding pieces of scrap wood under Daniel's patient guidance. Their landlord proved to be an excellent teacher, showing Lucas how to measure twice and cut once, how to feel for the grain of the wood, how to choose the right tool for each task. "My grandfather taught me when I was about your age," Daniel explained one afternoon, as Lucas struggled with a particularly stubborn piece of oak. "Said working with wood teaches you patience because you can't rush the process. The wood will tell you what it wants to become if you listen carefully enough." Sarah watched these interactions from the kitchen window as she prepared dinner, noting how naturally Daniel related to her children. He never talked down to them or dismissed their questions, but he also never pretended that difficult things were easy. When Lucas grew frustrated with a project, Daniel would sit beside him and work on his own piece, demonstrating techniques without making the boy feel like he was being corrected. With Maya, Daniel showed equal patience as she worked through art projects that grew more ambitious each day. He'd quietly appeared with better paper when her sketches outgrew the original pad, and somehow always seemed to have suggestions for new techniques when she was ready to try something more challenging. "You've got a good eye for composition," he told her one evening as she worked on a watercolor of Gertie. "See how you instinctively left more space on the left side of the paper? That gives the painting room to breathe." Maya looked up from her work, paintbrush poised in mid-stroke. "Did your brother teach you about art?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his expression growing distant. "We taught each other, I suppose. He was always the one with natural talent, but I picked up a few things along the way." It was the most he'd ever said about his brother, and Maya sensed there were depths to the story that she wasn't ready to explore. But she filed the information away with her other observations, building a mental picture of Daniel that grew more complex each day. The twins had settled into their new school with surprising ease. The rural elementary school was smaller than their previous urban campus, with mixed-age classrooms and teachers who seemed to know every child's family situation. Maya discovered a love for the science projects that were easier to manage when you had access to outdoor laboratories, while Lucas found his confidence growing in an environment where being quiet was seen as thoughtful rather than problematic. Sarah had managed to pick up extra shifts at the regional hospital, a 40-minute drive from the property but worth the commute for the increased income. The arrangement with Daniel remained deliberately vague, with both adults seeming to prefer the flexibility of an undefined relationship rather than the constraints of a formal lease agreement. She helped with household tasks around the main house, though Daniel rarely invited her inside. Instead, she tended to outdoor projects, weeding the neglected flower beds, organizing the storage areas, maintaining the vegetable garden that was beginning to show signs of winter dormancy. The work felt good after years of apartment living, connecting her to seasons and growing things in ways she'd forgotten she missed. One afternoon, as she was cleaning out a storage room in the barn's lower level, Sarah discovered something that stopped her cold. Hidden behind boxes of old farming equipment was a framed newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, but still legible. The headline read, "Local artist's work featured in Metropolitan Museum exhibition," and the accompanying photograph showed a man who looked remarkably like a younger version of Daniel. Sarah studied the image carefully. The facial structure was nearly identical, but this man's hair was longer, his clothing more bohemian, his expression carrying an intensity that Daniel kept carefully hidden. The article was datelined 7 years ago, and it described the success of an artist named Marcus Morrison, whose landscape paintings were being celebrated for their revolutionary approach to capturing the spiritual essence of rural American life. Marcus Morrison, Daniel's brother, the one who died of cancer 3 years ago. According to the article, his work was selling for substantial sums to collectors who appreciated his unique vision and masterful technique. The piece mentioned that Marcus had retreated from the art world to focus on his craft, working in isolation in a converted barn studio somewhere in the rural countryside. Sarah carefully replaced the clipping exactly where she'd found it, but her mind kept returning to the implications of what she'd discovered. If Daniel's brother had been a successful artist whose work was being exhibited in major museums, the paintings Maya had described finding in the old shed could be worth significant money. She began paying closer attention to Daniel's behavior, looking for signs that might explain his living situation. The property was well-maintained but modest. His truck was old but reliable. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable. Nothing about his lifestyle suggested wealth, but perhaps that was intentional. The mystery deepened when she noticed how carefully Daniel avoided certain topics in conversation. He never talked about his work before moving to the property, never mentioned family beyond his deceased brother, never explained how he'd acquired a place that seemed ideally suited for someone who understood both farming and artistic temperament. Meanwhile, the twins were thriving in ways that went beyond their improved living situation. Maya's artwork was becoming more sophisticated, her natural talent developing under Daniel's subtle guidance and the inspiration of having space to work. Lucas had completed his first woodworking project, a simple birdhouse that he'd painted with cheerful colors and mounted outside the barn's kitchen window. Their confidence was growing daily, fed by the security of stable housing and the attention of an adult who seemed genuinely interested in their development. They'd started inviting school friends to visit, proudly showing off their unusual living situation and the various animals that came with their rural lifestyle. Sarah found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't realized were possible. The constant anxiety of uncertain housing had faded, replaced by the rhythm of seasonal work and the satisfaction of contributing to a household that functioned smoothly. She was sleeping better, eating regular meals, and even beginning to think about long-term goals beyond simple survival. But the questions about Daniel remained, particularly after she'd started noticing the mail that arrived at the property. Most of it was addressed to Daniel Morrison, the usual collection of utility bills and agricultural supply catalogs. But occasionally there were letters addressed to Marcus Morrison, forwarded from various galleries and art institutions, usually marked "Please forward" in different handwriting. Daniel always collected the mail himself, sorting through it quickly before heading to the main house. Sarah never saw what happened to the letters addressed to his brother, but their continued arrival suggested that Marcus Morrison's death hadn't been widely reported in the art world. One evening, as she was helping the twins with their homework at the barn's kitchen table, Sarah heard unfamiliar voices coming from the direction of the main house. Through the window, she could see expensive-looking cars parked in Daniel's driveway, and several well-dressed people moving between the vehicles and the front porch. "Looks like Daniel has company," she mentioned casually to the twins, but Maya was already at the window, her curiosity piqued by the unusual activity. "There are a lot of fancy cars," Maya observed. "And those people are wearing the kind of clothes Mom wears to job interviews." Sarah joined her daughter at the window, noting the urban sophistication of Daniel's visitors. They looked out of place in the rural setting, their polished shoes and tailored clothing more suited to city boardrooms than farmhouse porches. The gathering had the feeling of a business meeting, though Sarah couldn't imagine what kind of business Daniel might conduct that would attract such obviously wealthy visitors. The meeting lasted about 2 hours, ending with handshakes that seemed to carry weight beyond simple politeness. As the visitors departed, Sarah noticed one of them hand Daniel what appeared to be a thick envelope before climbing into a black sedan that probably cost more than she'd made in the past 2 years. Daniel stood on his porch long after the cars had disappeared down the gravel driveway, holding the envelope and staring out at the fields where the last light of sunset was painting the grass in shades of gold and amber. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the tension in his posture, the way he held himself like someone carrying a burden too heavy to set down. The next morning brought the first hard frost of the season, coating the grass and remaining leaves with a crystalline layer that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. Maya was up early, trying to capture the effect in a watercolor before the sun melted the frost away. Daniel appeared earlier than usual, moving through his morning routine with what seemed like additional urgency. He fed the animals quickly, checked on the various maintenance projects around the property, and loaded several boxes into his truck with unusual care. "Taking some things to town," he explained, when Sarah asked if everything was all right. "Nothing to worry about, just some business I need to handle." But his expression suggested otherwise, and Sarah found herself wondering if the previous night's meeting had created some kind of deadline or obligation that was weighing on his mind. The twins left for school, as usual, chattering about their plans for the weekend and a science project that involved collecting different types of leaves. Sarah waved goodbye from the barn's porch, then settled into her weekly routine of deeper household tasks. She was organizing the storage closet when she heard Patch's yowling from somewhere outside, the sound more urgent than his usual commentary on the day's events. Following the noise, she found the barn cat sitting beside the old shed, where Maya had discovered the hidden paintings. His tail twitched with agitation. Sarah approached the shed cautiously, noting that the loose board Maya had crawled through was now propped open, as if someone had been moving larger items through the gap. Inside, the space was nearly empty. Only a few canvases remained, and those were covered with dust sheets that looked like they'd been hastily thrown over whatever had been deemed less important. The implications hit her immediately. Daniel had been removing the paintings, probably the ones he'd loaded into his truck that morning. The expensive cars, the business meeting, the envelope full of what was probably money. It was starting to form a picture that both explained and complicated everything she thought she understood about their situation. If Marcus Morrison's paintings were valuable enough to attract collectors willing to drive to the middle of nowhere, and if Daniel had been quietly selling them, then their mysterious benefactor might have resources far beyond what his modest lifestyle suggested. The question was whether he was simply managing his brother's estate or engaged in something more complicated. Sarah spent the rest of the day in a state of distracted concentration, completing her usual tasks while her mind churned through possibilities. By the time the twins returned from school, she'd decided that direct confrontation wasn't the right approach. Whatever Daniel's situation, he'd provided them with stability and kindness when they desperately needed both. If he had secrets, he probably had good reasons for keeping them. But that evening, as they gathered for dinner at the barn's kitchen table, Sarah found herself studying Daniel more carefully than usual. He seemed tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, and there was something in his expression that suggested he was wrestling with decisions that had no clear right answers. "Everything okay?" she asked as he helped clear the dinner dishes, their hands briefly touching as he passed her a plate. Daniel paused, meeting her eyes with an intensity that felt like he was trying to communicate something he couldn't say directly. "Sometimes doing the right thing gets complicated," he said finally. "But I want you to know that whatever happens, you and the kids have a place here as long as you need it." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. "Is there something we should know about? Something that might affect our living situation?" Daniel shook his head, but the gesture didn't quite convince her. Nothing that changes anything for you folks. I just want to make sure you understand that this arrangement isn't dependent on anything temporary. That night, after the twins had gone to bed, Sarah found herself unable to settle into her usual evening routine. She kept returning to the window that faced the main house, where lights burned later than usual, and shadows moved behind the curtains in ways that suggested someone packing or organizing rather than simply going about normal household tasks. Around midnight, she heard Daniel's truck start up and drive away, the headlights sweeping across the barn's windows as he headed toward the main road. He was gone for several hours, returning just before dawn, with what sounded like a much lighter load than he'd left with. The next few days passed in relative normalcy, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted. Daniel continued his usual routines, but there was a restlessness in his behavior that suggested someone waiting for news or preparing for change. The twins seemed oblivious to any underlying tension, focused on their school projects and the approaching Halloween holiday. Maya had decided to dress as a famous artist for the school's costume parade, complete with a beret and a palette of paint colors. Lucas was planning to be a carpenter, using some of his newly acquired woodworking skills to create props for his costume. Their enthusiasm for the holiday planning provided a welcome distraction from Sarah's growing concerns about Daniel's mysterious activities. But even as she helped them work on their costumes and listened to their excited chatter about trick-or-treating in their new neighborhood, she couldn't entirely ignore the feeling that their peaceful interlude was building towards some kind of resolution. The answer came the following Tuesday, in the form of a phone call that changed everything. Sarah was preparing lunch when she heard Daniel's phone ringing in the main house, followed by a conversation that was too muffled to understand, but carried the unmistakable tone of serious business. 20 minutes later, Daniel appeared at the barn's door, his expression carrying a mixture of relief and apprehension that immediately put Sarah on alert. "Could we talk?" he asked, glancing toward the twins, who were absorbed in their after-school snacks and homework. "Maybe on the porch?" Sarah followed him outside, noting the way he positioned himself so they could speak privately while still keeping an eye on Maya and Lucas through the window. The afternoon air was crisp with approaching winter, and the fields stretched endlessly under a sky that promised rain before evening. "I need to tell you something," Daniel began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been rehearsing a difficult conversation. "About who I am, and why I've been able to help you the way I have." Sarah waited, her heart beating faster as she prepared to learn whether her growing suspicions were accurate or whether the truth was something entirely different from what she'd imagined. "My brother Marcus was an artist," Daniel continued, "but he was also my twin. We looked so much alike that people often mistook us for each other, especially as we got older." He paused, studying Sarah's face as if gauging her reaction. "When he got sick, when he knew he was dying, he asked me to promise him something that seemed impossible at the time." The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves in Sarah's mind, forming a picture that was both more complex and more remarkable than she'd anticipated. "He wanted his work to continue helping people even after he was gone," Daniel said quietly. "But he also wanted to disappear from the art world on his own terms, without the circus that happens when a successful artist dies. So we came up with a plan that required me to become someone I never thought I could be." Sarah felt her breath catch as the full implications of what Daniel was telling her began to settle. "You've been pretending to be Marcus." Daniel nodded, his expression carrying years of complicated emotions. "For 3 years now, I've been Marcus Morrison to the art world, selling his paintings and managing his reputation while living as Daniel Morrison in the real world. It's allowed me to help people like you while honoring his wish that his work continue to make a difference." The revelation recontextualized everything Sarah thought she understood about their situation. The mysterious visitors, the expensive cars, the careful way Daniel had managed their living arrangement. It all made sense if he'd been operating with the resources of a successful artist while maintaining the lifestyle of a rural farmer. "But something's changed," she said, reading the tension in Daniel's posture. "The gallery that represents Marcus's work has been getting suspicious about his continued reclusiveness," Daniel explained. "They're demanding a meeting and interview, some kind of public appearance to coincide with a major retrospective they're planning. I can't keep pretending forever, and I'm not sure what happens to everything we've built when the truth comes out." Sarah looked through the window at her children, who were now helping each other with a math problem, their heads bent together in concentration. The life they'd built in the barn had given them stability and confidence and hope for the future. The thought of losing it felt like facing eviction all over again, but with even higher stakes. "What does this mean for us?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since she'd first noticed the inconsistencies in Daniel's story. Daniel turned to face her fully, his expression carrying a determination that seemed to come from deep within. "It means I need to make some decisions about how this story ends," he said. "And I was hoping you might help me figure out what the right choice looks like." The conversation that would change everything began at dawn 3 days later, when Sarah found Daniel sitting on the main house's porch steps, holding a coffee cup that had long gone cold. The morning mist was rising from the fields, creating an ethereal landscape that looked like something from one of Marcus's paintings. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah began, settling beside him on the weathered steps. "About needing help to figure out the right choice." Daniel glanced at her, his expression weary but grateful. "I've been carrying this alone for so long, I'm not sure I trust my own judgment anymore." "Tell me about Marcus," Sarah said gently. "Not the artist, but your brother. Help me understand what he would have wanted." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching Gertie investigate something interesting near the barn. "Marcus was the dreamer between us," he said finally. "Always saw possibilities where other people saw problems. When we were kids, I was the practical one, worried about how we'd pay for art supplies or whether his crazy ideas would get us in trouble. But Marcus believed that if something was meant to help people, the universe would find a way to make it work." He paused, setting down his untouched coffee. "When he got sick, when the doctors told us how little time he had left, most people would have focused on their legacy, their reputation, making sure their name lived on. But Marcus was obsessed with making sure his work continued to create opportunities for people who needed them." Sarah thought about the twins, asleep in the barn's loft, safe and warm because of choices Marcus had made from his deathbed. The money from his paintings, that's how you've been able to help people. 13 families so far, Daniel said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and exhaustion. Single parents, elderly folks who couldn't afford their medications, kids who needed surgery their families couldn't pay for. Marcus's paintings have been quietly changing lives for 3 years, and nobody in the art world has any idea. The magnitude of what Daniel had been managing hit Sarah like a revelation. He hadn't just been selling artwork. He'd been running a private charity funded by his dead brother's artistic legacy, all while maintaining the fiction that Marcus was still alive and working. "But the gallery suspicions are making it impossible to continue," she said, understanding the weight of the decision he was facing. Daniel nodded grimly. Hartwell Gallery has been Marcus's primary dealer for 8 years. They've been patient with his reclusiveness, but they're planning a major retrospective next spring, and they want him to participate in interviews, maybe even make an appearance at the opening. They're starting to ask questions I can't answer without destroying everything. Sarah could see the impossible position he'd created for himself. Revealing the truth would expose 3 years of deception, potentially invalidating contracts and sales, certainly ending his ability to continue Marcus's charitable work. But continuing the lie was becoming increasingly dangerous and unsustainable. What if there was another way? She asked slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. What if Marcus could make one final public appearance, something that would satisfy the gallery's needs, while allowing you to end this chapter on your own terms? Daniel looked at her with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "I don't see how that's possible without making things worse." "Because you're thinking like someone who's been carrying this burden alone," Sarah said, her voice growing more confident as the plan solidified in her thoughts. "But you're not alone anymore. You have people who care about you, who understand what Marcus's work has meant, who might be willing to help you find a solution that honors both brothers." Over the next hour, as the sun burned away the morning mist and the twins began stirring in the barn, Sarah outlined her idea. It was audacious and would require careful coordination, but it offered a path that could preserve Marcus's legacy while freeing Daniel from the impossible weight of his double life. The plan began to take shape over the following week, involving phone calls to the gallery, careful research into art world protocols, and most importantly, a conversation with Maya and Lucas about their role in something that could change all their lives. Sarah had been dreading that conversation, uncertain how to explain the complexity of Daniel's situation to children who were just beginning to understand the adult world's moral ambiguities. But the twins surprised her, as they often did, with their capacity for understanding concepts that seemed beyond their years. "So Daniel has been pretending to be his brother to help people," Maya said thoughtfully, after Sarah had carefully explained the situation. "Like Robin Hood, but with paintings instead of gold." Lucas nodded seriously. "And now he needs help because the pretending is getting too hard to keep up." "Something like that," Sarah agreed, amazed by their ability to distill complex ethical questions into terms they could process. "The question is whether we want to help him, even though it might mean some changes for us." Maya and Lucas exchanged one of those silent communications that twins sometimes shared, a conversation conducted entirely through expressions and subtle gestures. Finally, Maya spoke for both of them. "Daniel helped us when we didn't have anywhere to go," she said simply. "Now it's our turn to help him." The preparation took 2 weeks and involved more moving parts than Sarah had initially realized. Daniel had to contact Hartwell Gallery and arrange for Marcus Morrison's final interview to be conducted at the Barnes studio, where the reclusive artist had supposedly been working on his last series of paintings. Meanwhile, Sarah worked with Maya to create what would become the centerpiece of their deception, a collection of new paintings that could believably be attributed to Marcus Morrison's final creative period. Maya's natural talent, combined with Daniel's knowledge of his brother's techniques and Sarah's research into art historical precedents, produced work that captured Marcus's style while reflecting the fresh perspective of a young artist seeing the world with uncomplicated wonder. The paintings depicted the property as seen through Maya's eyes, the barn at different times of day, Gertie in various poses of goat dignity, the fields under changing weather conditions, Lucas working on his woodworking projects. They were unmistakably the work of someone who had found peace and purpose in rural life, which aligned perfectly with the story Daniel had been telling about Marcus's retreat from the art world. Lucas contributed by helping Daniel prepare the barn's main room to look like an active artist's studio. They arranged easels and art supplies, created the kind of organized chaos that suggested ongoing creative work, and even aged some of the newer paintings using techniques Daniel had learned from watching Marcus work. Sarah's role was perhaps the most crucial. She had to become Marcus Morrison's voice, the person who would speak for the reclusive artist during what would be his final public communication. She spent hours studying recordings of Marcus's old interviews, learning his speech patterns and artistic philosophy, until she could channel his perspective with convincing authenticity. The journalist from ART News arrived on a gray Thursday morning, driving a rental car that looked incongruous against the rural backdrop. Catherine Wells was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of eager professionalism that suggested someone building a reputation on exclusive access to difficult subjects. Daniel met her at the main house, playing the role of the property caretaker who had been instructed to escort visitors to the barn studio. His performance was flawless, combining deference with the protective attitude of someone who had been entrusted with guarding a valuable artist's privacy. "Mr. Eyes, Morrison asked me to apologize for not meeting you at the house," Daniel explained as they walked toward the barn. "He's been working on something important and doesn't like to lose momentum once he's started." Catherine nodded, clearly thrilled by the access she was being granted. "I understand he rarely gives interviews. This is quite an honor." "He's been very selective," Daniel agreed, but he felt it was time to share some thoughts about this new direction his work has been taking. Sarah was waiting in the barn's main room, dressed in clothes that suggested artistic bohemianism while remaining practical enough for actual work. She'd arranged herself at an easel, appearing to put finishing touches on one of Maya's paintings, and when Catherine entered, she looked up with the slightly distracted expression of someone reluctantly returning from creative absorption. "Ms. Wells," Sarah said, extending a paint-stained hand, "thank you for making the drive out here. I know it's not convenient, but I find I work better away from the distractions of the city." The interview proceeded more smoothly than Sarah had dared hope. Catherine's questions focused on Marcus's artistic evolution, his thoughts about the current state of contemporary art, and his plans for future work. Sarah drew on months of conversations with Daniel about his brother's actual philosophy, combined with her own observations about the way art could transform both creator and observer. "This new series feels different from your earlier work," Catherine observed, studying the paintings arranged around the studio. "There's a sense of peace here that wasn't present in your previous collections." "I think I've finally learned to listen," Sarah replied, choosing her words carefully. "For years, I was so focused on making statements about the world that I forgot to pay attention to what the world was trying to tell me. Living here, working here, has taught me that the most profound art sometimes comes from the quietest observations." She gestured toward Maya's painting of Lucas building his birdhouse, the image capturing both the intense concentration of a child learning a new skill and the simple beauty of hands creating something useful. Art doesn't always have to challenge or provoke. Sometimes it can simply witness, simply honor the small moments that make up a life. Catherine scribbled notes enthusiastically, clearly engaged by what she perceived as a mature artist's reflection on his life's work. "And what about the future? Are you planning any exhibitions? Any public appearances?" This was the moment Sarah had been most concerned about, the question that could make or break their elaborate deception. "I'm afraid this will be my last interview," she said, meeting Catherine's eyes with an expression that she hoped conveyed both regret and finality. "I've been dealing with some health issues that make it difficult to engage with the public aspects of an artistic career. I want to spend whatever time I have left focusing on the work itself, not on promoting it." Catherine's expression shifted to one of concern and disappointment. "I'm sorry to hear about your health problems. Is there anything specific you'd like people to know about this final phase of your career?" Sarah glanced around the studio, taking in the evidence of the life Daniel had built, the family he'd protected, the quiet good he'd been doing in Marcus's name. "I'd like people to know that art matters most when it serves something larger than itself," she said. "These paintings, this work, it's all been about creating connections, building bridges between people who might otherwise remain strangers to each other." She paused, thinking about Maya and Lucas, about the 13 families Daniel had helped, about the way kindness could multiply across generations when it was given freely and without expectation of return. "I hope that when people look at these paintings, they're reminded that we're all part of something bigger than our individual struggles. That even in the darkest times, there's always the possibility of finding light, finding home, finding family in unexpected places." The interview concluded with Catherine taking photographs of the studio, the paintings, and Sarah in her role as the reclusive Marcus Morrison. Throughout the process, Daniel remained in the background, playing his part as the devoted caretaker, while managing the complex logistics of their deception. After Catherine left, promising that the article would appear in the next month's issue, the 4 conspirators gathered in the barn's kitchen to decompress from their performance. Maya and Lucas had watched from the loft, staying out of sight but close enough to help if needed. "Do you think she believed it?" Maya asked, her eyes bright with the excitement of having participated in something both important and slightly dangerous. "I think she got the story she came looking for," Sarah replied carefully. "Sometimes that's more important than absolute truth." Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his expression carrying a mixture of relief and melancholy. "Marcus would have loved this," he said quietly. "The whole elaborate production, the way everyone pulled together to make it work. He always said the best art was collaborative, even when it looked like the work of a single person." Over the following weeks, they waited for the article to appear while preparing for the next phase of their plan. Daniel contacted Hartwell Gallery to arrange for the final sale of Marcus Morrison's remaining work, explaining that the artist's declining health made it necessary to close this chapter of his career. The gallery was disappointed but understanding, particularly after Catherine Wells's article appeared with glowing descriptions of Marcus's peaceful final creative period, and his thoughtful reflections on a career spent exploring the intersection of art and human connection. The piece included several photographs of Maya's paintings, which Catherine had praised for their mature simplicity and profound emotional resonance. The final sale exceeded everyone's expectations, with collectors eager to acquire what they believed to be the last works of a significant American artist. The proceeds would fund Daniel's charitable activities for years to come, ensuring that Marcus's vision of art serving community needs could continue long after his fictional retirement. But the most significant transformation wasn't financial. As winter settled over the property, the 4 residents of the converted barn found themselves becoming something that transcended their original arrangement. Maya and Lucas had begun calling Daniel Uncle Daniel, a title that reflected their growing sense of permanent family connection. Sarah and Daniel had developed the kind of partnership that grew from shared purpose and mutual respect, each bringing different strengths to their collaborative household. The art world accepted Marcus Morrison's retirement with the kind of reverence usually reserved for living masters who had earned the right to withdraw from public life on their own terms. Hartwell Gallery announced plans for the retrospective exhibition, using Catherine Wells' interview as the centerpiece of their marketing campaign. Daniel was finally free to be himself, no longer carrying the burden of maintaining his brother's public identity. But rather than returning to whatever life he'd lived before, he chose to continue the path that had brought them all together. "I've been thinking about something Marcus said near the end," Daniel told Sarah one evening as they sat in the barn's main room, watching Maya teach Lucas watercolor techniques while Patches supervised from his perch on the windowsill. He said that the best gifts are the ones that keep giving themselves, that find ways to multiply and spread beyond the original intention. Sarah looked around the space that had become their home, noting how naturally they'd all adapted to sharing life in ways that honored both privacy and community. "You think that's what happened here?" "I think we've all given each other gifts we didn't know we needed," Daniel replied. "And somehow those gifts have turned into something none of us could have created alone." The spring brought new projects and new possibilities. Maya's artwork continued to develop, and she began talking about art school in a way that suggested dreams grounded in realistic planning rather than wishful thinking. Lucas had progressed from simple woodworking projects to furniture pieces that showed genuine craftsmanship and creativity. Sarah had started taking online courses toward completing her psychology degree, finding time for study in the peaceful environment of their rural home. Daniel supported her academic goals while continuing his quiet charitable work, now with the help of a family that understood and shared his commitment to using resources for community benefit. The barn studio became a gathering place for other families that Daniel helped, a space where children could play safely while their parents worked through temporary difficulties with someone who understood both the practical and emotional challenges of rebuilding a life. One afternoon in late spring, as Sarah was helping Maya prepare canvases for a new series of paintings, she found herself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. The eviction that had seemed like catastrophe had led to Daniel's offer of shelter, which had led to discovering his secret, which had led to their collaborative deception, which had led to a security and happiness none of them had imagined possible. "Mom," Maya said, interrupting her thoughts, "do you think Marcus can see what we're doing? Do you think he knows how his paintings are still helping people?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the mystery of how kindness propagated across time and between people who would never meet. "I think he knew that good things have a way of creating more good things," she said finally, "and that when you plant something beautiful, you don't always get to see everything that grows from it." Lucas looked up from the birdhouse he was carefully sanding. "Like how the seeds from our garden will grow into vegetables next year, even though we planted them last spring?" "Exactly like that," Sarah agreed, struck by her son's intuitive understanding of concepts that many adults struggled to grasp. That evening, as they gathered for dinner at the table that had become the center of their shared life, Daniel raised his glass of water in an impromptu toast. "To Marcus," he said simply, "who taught us that the best stories are the ones where everyone gets to be the hero." They clinked glasses, even Lucas and Maya joining in with their milk glasses, acknowledging the invisible presence that had made their unconventional family possible. Outside the barn's windows, the field stretched endlessly under a sky painted in shades of gold and amber, the landscape that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to family, from desperation to hope, from survival to genuine joy. The secret of the barn had never really been about money, Sarah realized. The real secret had been about the way love could disguise itself as practicality, the way family could form around shared purpose rather than shared blood, and the way acts of kindness could create ripples that spread far beyond their original intention. As the twins headed upstairs to their loft bedrooms and Daniel began clearing the dinner dishes, Sarah stepped out onto the porch to watch the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The barn that had sheltered them stood solid and warm behind her, filled with the sounds of a family settling into another peaceful evening. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called across the fields, and Gertie answered with her own commentary on the day's events. The sounds of rural night were becoming as familiar as heartbeats, as comforting as lullabies, as permanent as love that had grown slowly and carefully from seeds of desperate need into something that would last for generations. The $180 million secret had been revealed and resolved, but the deeper secret, the one about how strangers could become family when they chose to care for each other, continued to unfold in ways that would touch lives far beyond the converted barn, where four people had learned that home wasn't a place you found, but something you created together, one day at a time, one act of kindness building upon another until the foundation became unshakable. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.